Welcome to Proudly Out of Line. I'm Mardi Moore, an old school dyke and the CEO of Boulder-based Rocky Mountain Equality. With everything going on around us in this world right now, it's the perfect time for all of us to be engaged, informed, and hopefully have a little fun along the way. On with the show. Listeners, please be aware that today's episode includes mentions of suicide and religious abuse. On with the show today. I am so grateful to be sitting across the table from Simon Fung. I didn't know who Simon was until I knew who Alana Chen was. Because I knew Alana's story and I'd gotten to meet Alana's mom, Joyce, and her siblings. And so I remember driving up into the mountains and turned on Simon's podcast and then couldn't turn it off. And since then, the Dear Alana podcast, I know I've listened to it 3 times. And anybody I talk to who's into podcasts, I always recommend. So to the folks listening today, go to whatever it is you use and you're going to find Dear Alana. And it's a story you need to hear. It's a painful story, and we'll talk some about that today. But with all of that, Simon, welcome to Boulder. Welcome to probably Colorado. You've been here a couple years now. Welcome.
Thank you, Marty. Thanks for having me. And I just got the little tour of your space today, and it's just been so moving to see all of this. And and to be in Colorado now, it's a bit surreal. And we can talk about how I got here. But yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming. And Simon and I, before we sat down to have what's a painful and serious conversation about conversion therapy, and we're recording this the day after the Supreme Court's ruling in Childs v. Salazar, an 8-1. As I said to my staff when we figured out who the one was, it's still true. Listen to black women. And, thank God for Justice Jackson. Yeah. So, but before we get into that, there's so much to cover today in a short period of time. I think I would start with your story.
Sure.
And if you would share that with the listeners. One of the things that I was saying to a producer before we got started was people talk about conversion therapy, but they don't know what they're talking about.
Right.
And so I think a real life experience of what that looks like in practice may be helpful for people.
Absolutely. So I grew up in Toronto, actually, and I was one of those kids who, you might know some of them in your life, but was a really kind of spiritual and devout child. My family wasn't particularly religious, but I was the kid who would pray every day, and I really kind of was drawn to the spiritual and to the religious. And so we grew up nominally Catholic, but from a young age, I really felt the sense of, in a weird way, being chosen and wanting to, and feeling this pull towards being a Catholic priest. There was something, special and meaningful that was there when I saw the priest every Sunday, and so that was an early kind of feeling I had. As I started to grow up, I was also the sensitive kid and really felt different, was bullied a lot as a young child, and often felt alone, and really God was kind of my, refuge, was my friend. And then as I started to really notice some of those differences in feelings and ways that I was relating to my peers start to emerge even more, I realized, oh my goodness, like maybe I'm this thing that they're saying is called gay, and that was really, really scary to me. And so when I entered like late high school and college, I was continuing down the path of discernment to be a priest. I met with spiritual directors. I just, visited different religious communities of, thinking of being a priest or a monk in some way. And I also, I guess, realized that because I took everything so seriously that the only way that I would be able to enter seminary would be if this part of me, this gay part of me went away. That was a message that I received both implicitly and explicitly from spiritual directors. And, yeah, when I first came out to my spiritual director, my priest, who was helping me in this discernment process, he said, well, and I told him, I'm ready to join the seminary, but I have this secret. He told me to go to this group and these organizations that were in various parts of the U.S. and to come back when I was healed. And that began my journey to move to New York City to, um, you know, uh, join internships and organizations that allowed me to live there while I paid for therapy in various forms. So I did one-on-one therapy with a Catholic therapist who specialized in, you conversion approaches to gender and sexuality. I went to group therapy with, oddly enough, other religious conservative, young men, including Mormons and Orthodox Jews. I went to weekend camp. I did a lot of spiritual programs that were focused on healing prayer and deliverance, that sort of saw this as a spiritual problem. And, like a lot of young people or a lot of people, both as kids and adults, this wasn't really foisted on me. I mean, I in some ways, yes, I got this message growing up, but my parents didn't ask me to do this. I actually told them when I came out to them that not only was I same sex attracted or gay, but that I was going to change this and that they were welcome to join me at a conference that was organized by Exodus International that following weekend. And so they came with me to that weekend,
Wow.
and where they learned all about how their faulty parenting made me
Oh
gay.
my God.
And they were also going through a process of grief because they realized that, or they were learning that they were also, that they were at fault. So that, was kind of my background. And, you know, that was how I started to go into these programs and explore them. And I'll talk a little bit about how conversion therapy has evolved over the last couple decades.
Please.
So I would say that, historically, homosexuality, and that's really the variant of conversion therapy that I'm most familiar with. So approaches that try to change sexual orientation. But traditionally, and over the last like 100 years or 100 years ago, right, homosexuality was either seen as a behavioral deviancy or a disease, and that was something that allowed, for example, the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Psychologists, for the DSM to classify homosexuality as a mental disorder, right? That was based on that understanding at the time, and it wasn't until much later, like I think it was in the late 70s, maybe.
1972, and the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force
That's right.
was on the ground and fought for that. And that's
You
what
were there.
I wasn't there. I'm not quite that old, but I am a big lover of. But they've been renamed to the LGBTQ Task Force, but
Right.
they're the oldest group, and that was their first win.
Okay. Right. Exactly. So
Yeah.
so they were, that ended up being corrected. And then around, a little bit before that, Freud came along, and he started developing theories around psychoanalysis and the ways that childhood trauma caused people to have mental disorders of various forms. And so, as folks were trying to figure out what to do with gay and lesbian people, right? They tried to change their orientation in a variety of ways, from very aversive techniques like shock therapy, sometimes lobotomies, nausea-inducing chemicals, to really get them to associate those attractions with physiological, like, discomfort, right? All the way through to the Freudian approach, which really is what has lasted now, this Freudian approach or neo-Freudian approach, where through talk therapy, through psychoanalysis, through trying to dig into trauma of the past, a therapist may try to change a person's orientation. And so my the kind of therapy that I went to for my therapist one-on-one as well as in the group setting was based on this Freudian kind of analysis. And the basic theory there is that, a young boy or young girl, because they don't get the male or female affirmation that they need either from their same-sex parent, or they get some sort of rejection from their opposite sex parent, that leads them to develop a sort of like deficiency in their sense of masculinity or femininity, and then because of that, they at puberty sort of sexualize that need, and that becomes the reason why they're attracted to the same gender or same sex. And that is like the um, high level theory that a lot of people in the 80s and 90s really ran with to develop these programs, these books, these materials that were all at that Exodus conference that I went to with my parents, that really try to help and understand and, in a way, fix people who were experiencing same-sex attraction. And so, yeah, I went through these programs. I would show up at my therapist's office, and we would talk about who I found attractive that week and what were some of the qualities that they exhibited, and connecting those qualities to trauma and doing sort of psychodynamic and somatic exercises that would connect me with that trauma and allow me to the theory, as the theory went, address that trauma so that I would unblock my natural heterosexuality. And that's sort of the mild version, in the sense of the like mechanics of it. But I think the deeper things that we did, not only in group and individual settings, was ultimately the ways in which it equipped each of us who went through these programs to disconnect and disassociate and deconstruct our own feelings and our own mind in a way that I think a lot of us are still living with, where we don't really trust what we're feeling and sensing and seeing. And we have to sort of associate it, because it's so associated with trauma. Like, we intentionally have to find that trauma in our past. It ends up being this weird thing that I think really impacts a lot of our day-to-day lives as well as our relationships, because it sort of cuts you off from that very like direct experience with yourself.
I am going to have to think about that. That was a lot. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah, sorry, I just
No, do
brain dumped
not.
on you.
No. All of it was impactful. That last piece, as you were talking and I was experiencing what you were saying, I think I ended up with a shallow question based upon what you've just described. And, we all have our own experiences, right? And I think
Yeah.
one of the things that I often have to deal with is a feeling of shame around failure. But what you're describing is much more of that. But in my simplistic world, is shame part of what
Yeah.
is that a feeling that they left you with?
Yeah, I would say that shame is really the core engine of people, you know, seeking conversion therapy. And in a weird way, it's kind of the incentive or the thing that keeps people going back to those programs. So the shame piece is, I would say, and it's taken me many years to reflect on this, because when I first stopped going to conversion therapy in my late 20s, I kind of thought, well, this is over. I'm going to take a break, and because I felt a lot of agency around doing this. I didn't feel like a victim, and I didn't like people using the word victim or survivor or anything like that. I felt like, no, this was something I did. It didn't work, but I kind of gained some amount of self-awareness, and I wasn't really aware of the actual impact on me until I started having some, real psychological symptoms of depression, and I couldn't figure out why. And it took me many years to reflect on that. And I think the way I describe it is that there's the shame that comes from being gay or lesbian or different in some way in these areas that sort of a lot of LGBT people carry with them, right, from a young age. That's just sort of a baseline thing. then there's the shame when you do go to conversion therapy that comes from being told that you're this way because something horrible happened to you, right? Or because your parents failed you in some way, or because you failed to um, belong in the ways that you needed, and it was sort of a failure on your end. And so there's the shame that comes from carrying that comes from the message that you get from therapy. And finally, there's the third level of shame, and that shame comes from when it doesn't work,
Mm.
and you feel, I remember feeling like, I put so much effort into this, so much time, so much money, um, so much prayer, that if God couldn't change this, then there must be something so wrong with me you know, that even He can't do this for me. And the shame that comes from feeling abandoned by God and feeling like you failed, and that there's something so dark inside of you that even God doesn't want to address, that is, I think, the crushing blow for a lot of young people, and why the consequences of conversion therapy for especially kids of faith is that they either attempt suicide at a much higher rate. Um, and I think a lot of that comes not so much, well, yes, there's mental devastation, but I think a lot of it comes from this deep despair. Um, or if they do survive, they leave their faith communities. And so I think the irony, which we'll talk about, I'm sure, over and over again in this conversation, is that the groups that are trying to promote conversion therapy in the name of faith, in the name of religion, in the name of God, are actually doing the opposite for their kids. These kids end up either self-harming or hurting themselves, or they leave their faith and their God and their communities, faith communities, which is kind of the last thing I'm sure anyone wants for people. Kids do better in their families. Kids do better in their communities. Like, why would you want to separate them from that? And so that's the irony and the tragedy of a lot of these attempts and these programs. And it's complicated why people still want these, and obviously I understand the desire to want to find a solution for something that's really distressing, right? But yeah, that's the role of shame. The impact of shame is, I think, the most devastating consequence of all of this. In addition to this, in addition to the psychological impacts, and I think the shame, in a way, is what keeps people going back to these programs. And in a way, I think it's a conflict of interest for convert therapists who offer these approaches, because it sort of requires that the client have the deep shame in order for them to want to rid themselves of these feelings.
That piece of shame that the last one that you ended on, that whereas like I'm too dark for God even to
Yeah,
help me.
yeah,
Um, I've had a couple of religious, what I term religious experiences, and as you were saying that, I flashed to a time. We're not going to go into details here. That's for my therapy, but
yeah,
um, 12, 13 years old in the middle of nowhere, and fell on my knees in a parking lot. And I had never been a big prayer. I wasn't that devout kid. I was told to pray at the kitchen table when we had dinner and that kind of stuff.
yeah.
But in that day, in my despair, I fell on my knees and said, God, help me.
Mm,
And I got a response, right? And so to
mm,
think about you
wow.
being in that situation where you're like, God, help me. You've invested your time, your resources, you've tried to cast yourself aside, and then to be met with, God's not helping me,
Yeah,
what it felt at the time. I'm really sorry that you experienced that. And um,
yeah.
do you still have your faith?
I do. I do. It's been I think probably it's hard to talk about because it's kind of such a deep thing.
If it's too
That's
much,
No, I mean, I could
don't.
try it in
Okay.
the sense that, yeah, I think a lot of people sort of wonder, how do you, or why do you stay, and what is it that makes you want to still uh, be part of this thing called the church. Um and I think, like, for me, those wounds still linger. Those, in a way, they're like any kind of abandonment wound, but
Mm.
in a way, this one was probably the deepest cut because with the it's an abandonment within a relationship that was probably the most important and meaningful thing for me, right? And most sacred for a lot of people. And but that aside, I mean, I think that uh, in a weird way, I feel that presence has never really left me. You know, I think maybe what had felt like abandonment was an idea of what I thought the presence wanted from me and of me, you know? But I see in real life and in, you know, experiences and coincidences and events that happen in my life that there's always been a way forward. You know, there's always been a way to begin again and to and that sort of deep sense of that connection that I had with God as a child is still there. You know, it's been tested, it's been tried. You know, it's been in a way like put through the ringer, but it's still there.
I'd go to your church any day. Let me know when you're starting it. As you were talking, so I grew up a Protestant, First
Yeah.
United Methodist Church, rural Colorado, and I had all this like stress around church. One, because in the days we call them tomboys. Like I never wanted to wear a dress, and on Sundays I'd have to put on this dress and black patent leather little shoes and go up into the church and color and learn about Jesus Christ. And I'm like, oh my God, the coloring was fine, and also like this story doesn't seem real. But so that's the background. But I remember as you were talking, seeing the sign that hung in the classroom or whatever they called it at the time, Sunday school,
Yep.
in the Sunday school, that said, God doesn't make mistakes.
Right.
And as you were telling your story, it's like, yeah, God doesn't make mistakes and I'm the mistake. Right.
Right.
And,
Exactly.
and I used language on myself as I started, realizing that something was different about me. I didn't have any language,
Right.
but that something was different about me. I had implicit or explicit, right? Mostly implicit in reading the Bible in those churches
Sure. Yeah.
that, homosexuality was not a good thing. That I never called myself a homosexual. I called myself a pervert.
Oh wow.
In my mind, I never said out loud to anybody, "I'm a pervert," but that was like the secret that you carry, and that's like, and I learned that in those rooms trying to do the right thing.
Mm. Mm.
To your point, so I
Wow.
think that your experience may be more universal,
Yeah.
but I wasn't that devout person. I just thought I was a cast off.
Mm.
And I think a lot of us end up feeling like that. And I had a conversation in the space yesterday with someone. They're like, "This group thinks it would grow if it wasn't in a church,"
Mm.
and that like that baggage, like how like historical trauma.
Yes.
Like at what point can we enter a church basement and not think somebody's yelling at us, "You're going to go to hell"?
Right.
And I think it depends on how often they yelled that at you
Yeah.
before it ever goes away. So thanks for sharing that story and taking me back so I could do a little digging
Yeah.
in my pieces of things too.
Yeah. And I think it's such a. I mean, it makes also me realize that like we are a lot of us like um maybe are not in church spaces anymore, not because we are being defiant or like this there's some sort of willful kind of desire to, I don't know, like to be subversive or in any way, but a lot of it is because we took everything so seriously. Like we took those messages seriously, we internalized them and we exiled ourselves, right? Like sort of like, I don't want to impose on this. I don't want to, I don't feel like there's a place for me here. And so I'm just gonna step aside. And And so I think, the characterization often of LGBT people as these sort of defiant, anti-religious people couldn't be farther from the truth. I mean, I'm sure a lot of folks exist who have that position, but a lot of us also are exiles from these communities, right? I mean, a lot of, I don't know what the stats are, but I remember reading that they're very high. Like a lot of LGBT people are Christian or still identify in some way as that, and um, so we're actually, in a way, like these divides that we see in society right now between secularism and religion and all of that, or LGBT folks and religious folks. It's like I think we have a lot more in common than we realize. We a lot of us were paying attention in
Can you
Sunday
say
school.
that louder for the people in the back?
Yeah,
I think we do have a lot more in common.
yeah,
I and in the First United Methodist Church, when they were having the United Methodists, when they were having their big fight on whether we were going to be open and affirming or welcoming,
yeah.
reconciling, I think is the Methodist word. And we had our Archbishop, who is lesbian, great lesbian, who's since moved to Canada.
Oh yeah.
Maybe you two just traded places. I think she's on that side of Canada too. But and the little church in my hometown voted to go with the haters, to
Oh
not become
wow.
welcoming. So the church split.
Okay.
And I called somebody that I had been an adult when I was a kid and said,
Mhm.
"Really?" And there was some rationalization around it, but
Yeah.
yeah, not welcome.
Right.
Not
Right.
welcome sign has been clearly hung
Yeah.
in one sect of that church and in many others.
Hmm.
Thanks for Simon for like going through what it looks like, what it looked like for you.
Hmm.
And I think when I started listening to your podcast, so you're in New York City, love
Hmm.
New York City. If I'd gone in my 30s, I'd still be there doing like another podcast from New York City. But here I am in Boulder, Colorado. Um, but you ended up on the West Coast, right?
Yeah, I ended up in the Bay Area for work primarily, and I was there for 10 years and had my career, had sort of stopped going to conversion therapy, was still discerning. I remember, I think it was
Mm-hmm.
my first or second year working at Google that I applied to seminary, actually.
Wow.
And I was willing to give it all up and just sort of do it. And I got rejected. And one of the reasons I got rejected, well, I'm sure it wasn't clear exactly because they didn't explain it, but in my application letter, I was very honest about the fact that I struggled with same-sex attraction as we describe it in a lot of church circles, and that I had gone through these programs and that I had tried really hard and that they didn't work or they hadn't worked, and that there was still a part of me that was just kind of like wondering if, that still was curious and desired relationship, but that I was willing to put that aside. I put it all out there, and I think it was at some level maybe, oh, I don't know, you could say an act of self-sabotage, but
Mhm.
the other the other level, it was like I kind of felt like if I had to be honest with God, if I was gonna get in, I didn't want to sneak in. I didn't want to have, because at the time, the official rule with Catholic seminaries was anyone with quote deep-seated same-sex attraction was not allowed to be accepted into seminary, which I took very seriously. I've since learned that most people don't, and they lie
Yeah.
because most of the clergy is actually homosexual, which is a bit of an open secret. But because I think I was so earnest and I wanted to get in or be accepted on the grounds of like full disclosure, I put it all on my application, and and I didn't get accepted. And I think at that point I felt very lost. I felt like, okay, what now? I had this sense of a calling and a dream that I had since I was a young child, and had it's in yeah, I thought that this was my path. What does God want now? And I was really confused for a moment. And so yeah, I ended up um I would say gosh, those years were a bit of a haze, but I reached a real breaking point because that was when a lot of my mental health stuff was started to come up,
Mm.
and a lot of depression, a lot of just feeling like I didn't have a future in some way. I think, the future that I had been on, the path I had been on, and the kind of future that I had imagined for myself, which was either a future into religious life or a future trying to quote unquote heal, um, didn't seem to be open anymore, right? Like, and the healing wasn't working, and so it just felt like sort of a dead end. And I think in that moment I kind of cried out to God and really was like, I really need to start looking at this thing that I've been trying to get rid of. And I really need to like, even if it means I'll go to hell, like I really need to be honest and stop trying to get rid of it and start engaging and being curious and kind of made this deal with God that I would do that. And yeah, and that began a journey and allowed me to enter spaces that I would never have walked in. I'd never been to a pride parade. I'd never been to an affirming church, all of that was like heretical for me in my understanding. And and it was there that I met all sorts of people that didn't have a lot of this baggage, that I met older gay religious people that were out and had lives that were full and meaningful, and I was like, oh my God, there's a future. Like, I'd never
Hmm.
thought there was a future in the way that I am. And still hung on to the idea that I could change and all of that, but it was really a real grace that in a weird way at my sort of rope's end, I was willing to, or had the sort of survival instinct to just, let go of the ideas that I had about my life. Um, and then a few years into that, it was really, yeah, that I remember I was, you're going to laugh at this. I was in Seattle for a Brandy Carlisle concert.
I might have been there.
And it was like
Yeah.
the day of. I was in a coffee shop and sort of waiting for the concert in the evening. And I was on my phone scrolling through social media, and that was when I read about Alana Chen's death.
Oh,
It was right when it happened, 2019. And Alana Chen, as will hear, and your listeners may be familiar with, Alana Chen was a young woman from Boulder, actually Longmont.
mhm.
Um, she went to CU Boulder, and she was like me in many ways from her obituary. She was a church girly, she uh, was this avid volunteer, led youth groups and retreats. She wanted to be a nun. She, would feed the homeless under the bridge. And here in Boulder, she was the like superstar, church girl at CU Boulder. And, um, and it wasn't until later that her family discovered that she had been seeking conversion therapy. Um, and that she had come out to her priest when she was 14, who told her not to tell her parents about this, and that she would sort of secretly meet with him. And then, through other mentors of hers, was going through some of these kinds of approaches, right? Where she was told that her sexuality was the way it was because of mother wounds that she needed to fix. And yeah, and so I didn't know I didn't know a lot about this because it wasn't all documented, but I read some of the course outlines of her story in her obituary, and I just sort of was sobbing in this coffee shop because I recognized myself in her, from from some of that reporting. And I ended up finding a contact, I think through Facebook or on the internet, for her mom, Joyce. And I sent her an email and I said, hi, you don't know me. I'm a complete stranger, but I just want you to know that I am so sorry for your loss, and that, here's some of my background and experience. And if you ever need to talk, feel free to. And I wasn't expecting to hear from her at all. Obviously, it was so fresh. And a few months later, she replied and we got on the phone and we talked, and that conversation went on for 2 years. We would just talk, she would text, we would call, and I learned more about Alana. And I also realized how devastated and also confused the family was, because Alana kept so much of this from her family. You know, she would sneak out to go to church, take the bus out, and because her family wasn't that religious, and so I just kind of, it's that whole story stuck with me. And so a few years later, I decided I burned out from my tech job. It was post COVID. It was just a really hard time for everyone, and decided to take a break, move back home to my parents' house. And 2 a.m. one morning, I woke up, or I couldn't sleep, and I just had this very vivid image of, I need to like look into what happened to Alana. I really want to know more, and I want to document that process. And so the next day I called Joyce, as well as her attorney, and we talked. And I said, hey, and I brought in her sister as well. And I said, hey, like, I have this idea. What do you guys think? Like, it's kind of out there, but I really think that there's so much about her story that we still don't know. And um, her family was very open. They basically opened their doors to me. They said, look, we're not in a position to do this. Like, we're not going to talk to all these people, but you're more than welcome to. And they gave me access to all of Alana's belongings, her closet, her journals, everything. And it was a real act of trust and a privilege to be able to be, have that, have the access to that, and to be able to read that myself. And so I ended up spending 2 years to do this, and along the way found amazing collaborators, and we made this show called Dear Alana. It came out 2 summers ago, I think, and it hit number one in its first week. It's over 3 million, well over 3 million downloads now, and it really surprised, I think, me, because I really just wanted to make something that would speak to someone like myself or Alana as a teenager, that we would feel seen in and not patronized for our faith, and just really seen. And it ended up resonating with not only young kids or teenagers or young people who have faith. It resonated with adults, and it resonated with people who weren't religious. It resonated with, all sorts of people that could relate to her struggle. And she left behind 24 journals, and a lot of the podcast is really just uncovering what she wrote. And she's so honest and she's so real. And I think because of that, she speaks for, in a way, all of us who've ever felt this burning desire for belonging and for acceptance by a community, by God, and has in some way felt outside of that.
I have tears in my eyes. It's such a loss, and you really, the podcast is tremendous in the way you used her journals in telling the story and the interviews you did. It's just, and thinking about her family, I think of Joyce often. Yesterday, when the Supreme Court ruling came, the first person I heard from was Joyce, and she said, "The poor children."
Yeah.
I want to tell a kind of Alana's presence and gift continues to like give life to others, and even in her death. And so there's this guy who's like 6'10", I think his name is Josh Scott. He's a basketball player. He was Mr. CU basketball player. And so I met him through other channels, because they're trying to take trans kids out of sports or whatever. And they were putting up a statue at CU that is not in line with CU Boulder's values around marriage. But that topic aside, he came into the office to meet, and we got to talking. And he grew up in Colorado Springs. His family was, part of Focus on the Family, and and he, had been driven into his head that it's not okay to be gay, and here he is, big macho, muscled guy, and of course not. And so he's a closeted player at CU. And when he was a senior, Alana's brother was a freshman on the team. And so he knew, I can't remember Alana's brother's name right now, but he knew him.
Sammy.
Sammy, yes, thank you. So he knew Sammy, and when Alana took her own life,
Yeah.
Josh said to himself, "Enough is enough," and came out.
Oh, wow.
And he's living a life free and the life that he always wanted to live. And so that story came in like the side door for me that day. And
Wow.
um,
Oh my God.
so the storytelling you did on that is saving lives. So just know the 2 years that you devoted. I know one story, and I don't know that many people. And with 3 million people have downloaded it, I think there's probably other lives that you've made better in the change. So thank you for that, and I was so grateful. So then
Yeah.
Josh and I have become buddies. He
Okay.
plays basketball in Japan right now.
Oh, cool.
We've had him here in the podcast room.
Yeah.
Actually, he did it virtually from Japan when we got to talk to him. But so
Wow.
thanks for all that, and
Yeah.
in how tragic it was, it really has helped others.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, really, it's a testament to Alana's legacy, and
Hmm.
it's there's no kind of like way to rationalize any of it, but it is. I mean, I do feel her presence now still, and it continues, and yeah, it's her legacy continues, and I know is inspiring and helping a lot of people who uh need an example of someone who's yeah who is like her, who is honest and who is caught in this double bind that I think a lot of young people are caught in when they are trying or told in a way they have to choose between their faith and their core parts of their identity, and and I know there's it's more complicated than that, and it's as someone who's had to navigate a lot of uh those ideas, like, yes, I'm speaking like I it's such a simple thing. Oh, why don't you just think this way? No, it's not. Like, when you're in it, it's like it's there's so many layers. Yeah.
And her family, and thinking about Alana's legacy, the
Hmm.
Alana Chen Foundation. If any of our listeners want to
Yes.
support that foundation for in Alana's memory, they're easy to find on the website. Make a
Yes.
donation, and Joyce and the family ensure that those dollars go to people in need of mental health support. So,
Exactly. Mental health support for LGBT
yep,
kids. It's amazing, beautiful legacy for her.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So, because you knew Joyce,
Hmm.
and because she loves you, and because we're in beautiful Colorado,
Beautiful Colorado.
how'd you get here?
So I was making trips back and forth here while making the podcast, and finally was like, I gotta just, you know, stay here until this is done. And so I did that. And in addition to that, I met my now dear friend and producer and the composer on the show, Lori, who is based here at the time in Boulder, now in Denver. And so I was just like, well, it's just going to be easier to make the show and finish it. I thought it would take, a couple months, took another year, and yeah, and so when the show finished and wrapped, there was still a lot of like press, and they say like making the thing is just really the halfway point, right? Promoting it, which I had not accounted for in any way. I was just like, all right, I'm done. Like, is actually a whole other journey, and so I took another couple months to do that, and was doing that from here, and it ended up going back to Toronto, and got really sick for a few months. I think a lot of the toll in making it finally hit me, and um, so that whole year was a bit of a wash after the show came out, and I didn't really have a direction, but I realized, well, my car's still in Colorado. I guess I'm just going to come back here, and so I did, and I ended up staying. So I'm here now. I'm now a resident. Ended up getting my stuff out of storage from the Bay Area, and transporting it here, which just arrived last month.
Oh my goodness.
So I'm here now. I'm officially planted,
Lucky us.
and,
Thanks for coming.
and I love it here. It's really beautiful. I never, in the podcast, if you decide to listen, for those who listen or have, I talk about how this girl I had never met in real life really changed my life. That statement continues to be true. Like, I'm literally here now in Colorado because of Alana.
Yeah.
I have no idea where it's going, what I'm doing here, but I fall in love with the state. I love the nature. I fall in love with the mountains. Um, so yeah, here
I
I am.
remember Joyce was I remember where I was in the car, and we were talking in the car, and she's like, "And Simon might move here. We need to find him a boyfriend." And so we were like going like this, and so like to jump ahead in the story a little bit. So one day I'm like, I finally got enough courage to call Simon. I'd gotten his number, and I'm like, I'm so scared to call Simon, and so Simon called, and we started talking, and I like figured out who he was pretty quickly. Loving, kind soul. And I'm like, I know this other guy. And so I mentioned the other guy's name who's just like him. And he's like, oh, we're best friends. Like, and so, anyway, not getting into your love life, but Joyce and I have kind of been on it. So I'm glad you've taken care of things yourself. But here you are in Colorado,
Yeah.
in a state that was known as the hate state back in the early 90s because of an amendment to our Constitution that was passed by voters that basically would have ensured that gays and lesbians had no rights in this state.
Mm.
It was overturned in front of the Supreme Court, argued by Boulder's own Gene Dabowski, who's still alive and well here, in a case called Romer versus Evans. Romer was the governor at the time. He hated the fact that it got named after him. He didn't want to argue this case, but he had to. Really great guy, still alive, 97. Saw him speak last week. He makes me look like I'm sleeping, but he uses a cane. But in that case, so Colorado, with focus on family establishing itself here, with other hate groups here, with Colorado's progression over the years into a purplish, bluish kind of state that does the right thing, that values freedom, that values privacy, those kind of things. We've passed some really good laws. Have they always been bipartisan? No. But we have good laws that we followed.
Yeah.
Back when Daniel Ramos was the executive director of One Colorado, they were able to get through the state legislature a bill that banned conversion therapy in the state of Colorado. At the time, at that bill, which is still in effect, and law takes time to work out, and we can get into some of that. But it had a carve out for religious exemptions, which always annoyed me. It's like most conversion therapy is done by religious zealots who think there's something wrong with us. But there was that carve out, and I get that there's freedom of religion in our Constitution. I hear there's still a Constitution. I haven't seen it play out lately, but I understand there is still one, and that is one of them that they'll hang that and their guns. They're going to hang on to no matter what, right? But
Right.
the rest of them might go, but. So that was already there, and they, much like the Masterpiece Cake Shop case that came out of Colorado a few years ago and went to the Supreme Court, it's like, well, what if I did this and then this happened? So it's all these hypotheticals, right? They make their way to the Supreme Court because they're funded by great groups. I say that kiddingly, like Alliance Defending Freedom and all these, far right people who seem to make a living and have fun in attacking the LGBTQ community in particular. And so this woman in Colorado Springs now says, well, if I did this, then I might not get business and it would impact me. And so so they argued. But as we were following it along, a Colorado case, and I got to interview Attorney General Weiser here right before he went to, he and his team went. He did not argue in front of the Supreme Court. His team did,
Right.
Which I think is an interesting distinction that we need to always make.
Yes.
But his team argued in front of it. But it took a lot of work to get to the point of what the arguments were going to be. I'd heard at the time and never told anyone, I swear, Simon, that you were working behind the scenes in helping prep for that case. Would you tell us, like, you're new to Colorado, all of a sudden you're sitting with the Attorney General and a team, and how did you end up there?
Yeah. So I was speaking at a conference with Joyce actually, and uh, Phil Weiser was there,
Oh,
and he heard Alana's story, and he approached me afterwards and said basically that he said, you know, my team is going to be defending this law at the Supreme Court in the fall. Would you come speak to us? And so I agreed happily and showed up at the office, and I think like you know this right out of the gate, having read some of the initial the initial documentation in the case, this was before, this was sort of in the early summer, and so there was still an opportunity for Colorado to reply, and so there was a process of getting all the stuff into the docket. Um, I read some of those initial documents and the complaint and the claims that were being made by the therapist Kaylee Childs here in Colorado Springs, and I immediately recognized what was going on. First of all, just as background, this uh, far like conservative right world has been, and in some ways I'm still connected to that world for a lot of my adulthood. Um, some of my early jobs in New York were with some of these groups that uh, are now part of the coalition that drafted Project 2025, and so this is not new to me at all as far as the strategy, the language, the polemics around any of these issues, because I was sort of on that side.
yeah.
You know what I mean? And right away, I saw what they were doing was they were taking a part of the statute or of the Colorado law, which is called the Minor Conversion Therapy Law, which passed in 2019. It's very short; it's only about a paragraph long, but they were taking certain clauses out of that and reading them in isolation in a way to interpret it to mean that um, so basically the law, if you look at it holistically, says that any attempt by a licensed therapist in the state of Colorado to try to change a person's sexual orientation or gender identity um, is prohibited, right? That's basically what the law says. And then it has a couple more sentences and statements or clauses that say what it's not, and what counts, what doesn't count, and it sort of clarifies that. Um, what these groups were doing was that they were taking parts of the law, reading, I think, certain pieces in isolation to interpret it in such a way to say that under Colorado's law, a therapist can only counsel a child to become transgender or gay, and that any attempt or any kind of counseling that resulted in a different outcome that was not that would potentially be considered conversion therapy. And so that, if that's the interpretation, that's scary, right? That's scary for everyone. Like if you're saying no, as a therapist you can only affirm one direction of a child's orientation or gender identity, I mean, that, I think anyone with common sense would feel that was wrong, right? Um, and uh, that was, I think, the big misreading, which if you take certain clauses in isolation, you might arrive at that conclusion. And there's some probably way to write this in a way that really doesn't interpret it that way. But um, but so right out of the gate, I knew that the way that this was being framed was going to hijack people's fear responses, because the moment you put the word children and the word transgender in the same sentence right now, it's just dynamite, right? It sort of like immediately sets off a cascade of ideas and associations and fears, right, in a lot of people, and and that was the playbook, and we talked about that, and we talked about how um, the way that this was being argued was on a very emotional level, and in fact, the uh, so there's a process during any sort of Supreme Court case where outsiders to the case can actually submit letters to support either side of the case, to support a specific outcome and say, look, we want you to rule this way or that way. In the case of this case, Charles v. Salazar, Childs, so the therapist who was arguing that she was her speech rights were being violated by this law, she got over 60 amicus briefs in support of her from groups that I'm very familiar with, from a lot of Christian organizations, Christian legal organizations, from my own U.S. bishops. It's very painful to read all of these. I read through the entire docket versus the groups that were supporting Colorado's case here, got only about 20. So you can see the asymmetry in just the money, um, and um, and I think one of the challenges in this case was there's the constitutional issue that's being debated, which is a very narrow one, right? Which is basically, do laws governing therapeutic conversations violate First Amendment free speech, right? And if you zoom out a bit, it's basically asking um, is talk therapy speech, right? And the court yesterday ruled that talk therapy can be considered speech and protected by First Amendment, and not medical conduct, right? Um, and and there's also a lot of technicalities about what it did. The ruling essentially uh, told Colorado to go back to the 10th Circuit and now try to pass this law, or see the law through this process of what's called strict scrutiny to see if there are compelling reasons why it should um, uh, impinge on First Amendment rights. But the moment that you now put therapy into the category of First Amendment right, or First Amendment practice, is, I mean, in a way, like kind of like the can of worms, right? And this is what Justice Jackson was writing in her dissent, is that you know, we don't really know what this is going to do. And I think listening to the oral arguments and reading the ruling yesterday, it made me really wonder, like, if any of the justices have ever actually been to therapy, because therapy is,
I've wondered that for a long time, but go ahead with your story.
yeah, I don't think we Colorado made it good enough case um to argue this, but I mean, therapy, I would say, is more akin to a medical conversation,
Yes.
right? Yes, it happens through talking, but um, but it has real life health.
Regulations.
Yeah, it has regulations. There are evidence-based
Yeah.
protocols, and it has real consequences on mental health and what you might do or not do outside of the therapist's office.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? A therapist deals with mental health conditions like anxiety and depression and and compulsions and all sorts of things that, like, are conditions. Do you know what I mean?
Mhm.
And so, and therapists go to school, counselors and therapists go to school and get tons of hours, and in some cases get their doctorate, not so that they can have a chit chat with their friend. Like, that's not what this is. And I think that the failure to put therapeutic conversations into that category, is where things started going off the rails in this case,
Mhm.
right? And so you have the constitutional piece of this, alongside the emotional piece of this. That's the backdrop of this, right? So a lot of the amicus briefs that were submitted, in my opinion, didn't even read the Colorado law, and I sort of piled on and copy and pasted this idea that you're transing my children. Colorado wants to trans my children, and so they were sort of assuming that was the case, and then making all sorts of arguments, theological or otherwise, about why that was a bad idea. And so you had this sort of like emotional engine that was powering this conversation at one level. You had the sort of deeper question of what actually should we consider therapeutic talk therapy, right? And then the last, angle to this is, and where I felt like I in a way try to offer the most value to the office, was about how to talk about gender and sexuality to religious people, right? Which is most of the court.
Yeah.
And the way you do that isn't necessarily waving a rainbow flag and talking about how this is our right and this is who we are. Like, you know, you don't need to you don't need to say any of that stuff. You don't need to get into any of that in order to win this case, right? You don't need to get into sort of these philosophical debates about, whether or not this is truly who a person is or not, in order to lean on the fact that all medical and psychological associations have considered conversion therapy ineffective and
Right.
dangerous, right? Like
Yep.
this is not
Not
you have
not
to touch that.
debatable.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, exactly. So I think that there were a lot of factors working against Colorado, a lot of perception and narratives that made it really, really challenging. And um, and as I was listening to the oral arguments, as much as we prepared and tried to prepare, unfortunately, I think that we failed to uh, distinguish talk therapy and put it into a category that um, was unrelated to speech. And I think we failed to, um, I think we triggered the court in some instances. I think we weren't able to necessarily come out of the gate swinging with some of the blatant misrepresentations of the law in a way that could proactively put some of those concerns to rest, even though there were attempts. And I think ultimately the court didn't believe Colorado that this was how we were interpreting the law, that we were interpreting the law in a neutral way that applied both ways. Just as you can't try to change a kid from gay to straight, you also can't try to change a kid from straight to gay, right? It would actually prohibit, let's say, some therapist with a LGBT agenda, which is really their fear, from doing this to your kids. The law actually works that way too,
Yeah.
right? And so it is symmetrical. And I think we weren't able to necessarily convince the court about that because of some of these perceptions around, big woke Colorado kind of thing. So anyways, all of that is to say it was a real uphill battle, an eye-opening experience as someone who was sort of able to see both sides of this in a way,
Hmm.
or see the maybe not so much the
Approach.
legal, but yeah, see the different approaches. Um, and in a way, I think it was the lessons weren't learned, and the learning opportunity for all of us is that these laws don't exist in a vacuum. They don't apply to people in a vacuum, and that the more we can actually bring on perspectives um, that can address some of these concerns out of the gate, the better chance something has at surviving. Not saying that it will, right? But all the time. Um, but I think in a way my presence there was an odd duck, and an odd kind of outlier in the room among other folks that they had consulted with, because I was able to bring that perspective.
Wow. Thanks for all that. And what hindsight so quickly. You must not have slept much.
Yeah, it took me, all of yesterday to read through the ruling, and then I was doing a couple of interviews, and I think you're getting the kind of like, me also reflecting on some of what I had said earlier and some of
Yeah.
the processing that was happening throughout the day. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much. We're getting close on time, and I think you and I could probably sit here for a couple more hours and have some great conversations.
Yes.
And I hope we get to do that in the future. I wow. So in every podcast, we end with a couple of fun things because if you're not having fun, you're in the wrong business, and we've got to have some fun along the way.
Yeah.
And so one of the questions is, who's your queer icon?
Oh my God. Um, I would say it's James Baldwin.
Oh, well, great. Is
Um,
there a favorite quote that's coming to your mind right now, or is there something you have?
oh, a quote. I don't think I could quote him. He's so singular. I
Hmm.
I would say I just his like just his uh,
Singular.
absolute fearlessness to
Yeah.
speak the truth,
Yeah.
and no matter how painful it might be, and in a way that's from a place of love, right? It's like, I love this country. I love these people. That's why I want us to transcend these divides, like that's very much the spirit of Baldwin, as hard as he can be to read if you are sort of in the line of fire of his critique, right? But no, I mean, I think just that combination of tenacious, um and and you know uh, commitment to saying the hard things while also doing this from a real place of love and desire and passion. Yeah.
On that, I want to thank you so much for joining us today on Proudly Out of Line, because I think you're probably proudly out of line too. Listeners, I hope that you've learned as much and felt as much as I have in this session. Simon, thank you.
Thanks, Marty.
Proudly Out of Line is brought to you by Rocky Mountain Equality, with help from your host, Mardi Moore, executive producer, Amy Zuckerman, audio producer, Theo Conover. Until next time,